So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for organizing this event today. It's a very overwhelming day. So much good science, but quite a lot of emotions as well. And for those who don't know me, my name is Esther Githumbi. I'm a late quaternary researcher, originally from Kenya, but at the moment I'm in Sweden. And I've only met Eric twice, in Bondi 2019 and in Amsterdam during the APD Data Steward training workshop. So when I was asked to present a talk, I have to say I was overwhelmed because I was like, I couldn't think of anything of substance. What can I possibly say? And then I remembered that Eric was very kind, very generous with his time. And it got me thinking, when you look back in paleoecology, and I'm going to be a bit specific thinking about paleoecology in general, we've had so many great researchers who've come ahead of us, done so much groundwork in different fields. And a lot of them are quite wonderful in terms of, you see all of these great manuscripts, all these publications. So these are the superstars in our field. And then you meet them and you can't imagine that this person who's talking to you with such kindness and giving you so much of the time is the same person who comes up with this great science that you see, because it's very hard to reconcile those two. But it's not just Eric. I think we're very fortunate in our field for having people who are so willing to share their time with especially as a young researcher. I've had so many instances of feeling overwhelmed, not knowing when I'm looking at the data, what is it, what's going on? And then you go to these manuscripts. When you read them, you can always email the authors and they respond. So for me, this is why I chose this title, Looking Back. So Holocene Vegetation Dynamics from Two Kenyan Landscapes is sort of a recap of my PhD work, trying to be like, what is it that I've actually learned from the first project that I got to do on my own? So I use this figure, and this figure is from Merchant et al. 2018. So it was a manuscript that was doing a review of paleoecological development within East Africa using records that cover the last 6,000 years. And you can see there are actually several paleo records from East Africa. So this map is highlighting a list of 41 sites. So we know right off, we have 41 sites from East Africa. Whether they're freely available or not, that is a question that we have to think about. But what was the aim of my study? And as a young researcher, trying to think of what is it that you're doing, you have to start small. And with paleoecology, always start with, we need to get some more data points. So developing new multi-proxy records of environmental history. And then what do you do with that data? And it's to try and fill in the data gaps just by adding more data. So how interpreting the new records within the existing paleoecological, archaeological, and anthropological data. So, and this is in East Africa. So my two sites that I worked in are highlighted here in the red semicircles or ovals. And the one at the top is an Afro mountain. It's located in an area known as the Mao Forest. And the one at the bottom, this is the Amboseli Savannah. And as you can see, it already has an 11 in there because that area has already been sampled before, because there are quite a number of wetlands. So previous to my study, there was already some work that had been going on there. And so with paleoecological studies, most times we need more than one proxy to help us understand what might be happening. So for this work, we employed pollen analysis, macrocharcoal analysis, geochemical analysis, geophysical analysis, and of course the age depth models. And for the pollen, what we did was that I identified and counted pollen grains. So for each sample, a minimum of 300 pollen grains, excluding Poaceae and Cyperaceae. And this is because we used the pollen percentages to describe the vegetation change through time. And then of course we have the macrocharcoal analysis. And because macro charcoal is a bit easier to do, we opted to go at a high resolution. So for all of the records that we analyzed, we sampled at a resolution of 0.5 centimeter or 1 centimeter. And of course, there was the disaggregation and wet sieving and at 125 microns. The geochemical analysis, this was done at 2 labs. So the 3 of the records were sampled at Boscov, and then 1 was sampled at the University of Aberystwyth. And that particular record, that's another example of having people who are already established being very kind with their time and their energy, because I remember I spent a whole day on the train from York to Aberystwyth with about 40 kg of sediment. And I was met by Henry Lamb, who helped me take them up to the lab and set it up so that the next day I'd be able to begin the ITRAX analysis. So that kind of, what do you call it? That kind of help that we extend to other researchers, I think is very impactful. And of course, the geochemical data, they represent a semi-quantitative measurement of elemental composition, and the geophysical analysis, so the loss on ignition, the carbonate analysis, the particle size analysis, all of that I did at the University of York, and what that provides us is sediment structure information. And of course, we have the sediments that's sampled and dated, so radiocarbon dating and lead dating. So the first site is the Nyafuyafui Wetland, and the Nyafuyafui Wetland is located in Mau Forest. And the reason this site was selected is that Mau Forest is a very important ecosystem or landscape, not just in Kenya, but within East Africa. And that's because it is currently the largest large continuous forest stand. And so, for example, the Eastern Mau forest block covers an area of over 29,000 hectares. So the wetland itself, this top left figure representation is quite a small wetland. And the photos at the bottom right show what the immediate surrounding of the wetland looks like. So it's mainly an open grassland, and that's because there's quite a lot of grazing. And the little graph that we have at the center is showing from the nearest Met station. So this is a precipitation from 1968. And basically the main point is that the March, April, May is the main wet season. So the Mau forest provides water for rural, urban, and urban settlements, as well as pastoral communities. As I said, it's a water tower. It's in Kenya or in East Africa, it's referred to as one of the 5 water towers. It contains several headwater catchments, and the ones that are known the most, or I would say most famous, is that we have the ones that flow through the Rift Valley towards Lake Victoria, but we also have the Mara River that flows into the Masai Mara and Serengeti. And I think that one is the famous one that everybody gets to see, with the wildebeest crossing and the crocodiles having a party. The Mau forest is also has quite a high floral and faunal biodiversity. So both large game that are indigenous and threatened. So for example, the bongo, the yellow-backed duiker, the golden cat. So these are some of the animals that have been spotted in the different Mau forest blocks. And there's also scattered minor remains of indigenous broadleaf forests. So, and there isn't a long-term ecological record. So not just paleoecological, but even there wasn't an ecological record available from the Mau forest. So this is why we felt quite lucky when we came upon the Nyafuyafui wetland. The second site is the other cores are found within the Amboseli wetland. And so the Amboseli wetland again, the Amboseli Savannah ecosystem is also quite well known, and that's because it borders the Mara and Serengeti, and that whole area is known for its large herbivore stand. So in East Africa, savanna ecosystems cover 70 to 80%, and they're characterized by quite high temporal and spatial variability in both water availability, but also the vegetation resources. So the figure at the top left is a composite. So it's a map of Amboseli, and we went through the archives at the Bodleian, and we found a series of aerial photographs, black and white aerial photographs, and we tried to put them together. And the text might not be clear, but in red, you can just see where some of the wetlands would be, but on different photos, and we've just overlaid them. And at the bottom, so we have Kimana Sanctuary, the image that says Kimana Sanctuary, that is an image, a photo taken using a quadcopter. But the rest of them to the right of that are just on the ground. And so, for example, the one at the complete end, those are hippos that we're seeing in the water. So Kimana Sanctuary is actually has quite a lot of wildlife even today. And below that, we have Omakau Swamp. So it's the same as before. We have an aerial photograph taken from a quadcopter, and then the others are just on the ground photos that we took during the field season. So from Amboseli, I say 5 wetlands, but the reason here there are only 4 is that the 5th wetland would be Namelok. However, these are the sites, and Namelok had already been caught before our field work. So these are the cores that we actually managed to get during our field season. And both for the 2 study areas, the field work was in 2014, 2015. And the reason I use this image at the bottom right is that one of the most interesting things so far from the Amboseli wetlands is that when you look at the charcoal, something happens at around 500 Kalia BP. And there's quite a lot of explanations and theories behind that. And I will go into that later. So even though there are 4 records here and I'm talking about 5, the reason I will talk about Amboseli is because it's currently the oldest, because it goes back to 5,000 Kalia BP. So but when we do this multi-proxy studies, this is one of the first sort of stratigraphic plots that you come up with. So this is a typical output, a stratigraphical representation where we have the radiocarbon dates, the lithology, the pollen zones, and itrax zones. This is done using colonies, and then of course the vegetation, the geophysical, and the geochemical. And if you're not in paleoecology, you look at this and it feels like a lot of information because it is a lot of data, but it's not, even I myself would not remember, for example, of all the 20 elements that we looked at, how are they changing over time? So the question is, what did I learn from the Nyafuyafui wetland record? And so this—
2 minutes, Esther.
Okay, and so this is what I tried to do. So if you think about it as changing between dry and moist, we have the first part of the record, it's cool and dry, then moves warm and dry, warm and moist, and then the last, the late Holocene, is warm and dry. But how did I come about this? This was basically looking at all the proxies, so the pollen, the charcoal, the itrax, and reading it in relation to all the other pollen records that we have, and trying to compare how they have interpreted the changes through time. And the interesting thing is that you can say there's quite a lot of relation. So there's quite a lot of records that agree when it's cool and dry, and so the changes through time are visible in quite a lot of records. And this, the bottom figure is just something that I did for my PhD, which was just a simple comparison across sites. So then it's the same with the Amboseli. Basically, Amboseli through time has been a semi-arid savanna. And we always have the Afro-montane, and this is because the Amboseli is close to Mount Kilimanjaro and the Chulu Hills. But there isn't much change in vegetation going on. So what is an interesting way of looking at this vegetation or this landscape, rather than just saying it's been a savanna through time? And this is where one of my colleagues, Colin, came up with why don't we try and visualize it? So we have these changes in the vegetation, in the pollen. I mean, yes, in the pollen, in the charcoal. What do you think that would look as a landscape? And this is what he came up with. And I think it's a very good representation, because it's not just what the landscape is looking at, but also how, for example, the livelihood strategies, and of course, then this is where you have collaboration between fields, because the livelihood strategies is not paleo data, it's archaeological data. And this is a very useful way, I think, of looking at some of these small sites, because Esambu is also a very small site, and what it gives you is a local representation of what is happening. And even when you have 5 small sites from the same area, it's still quite interesting to see how that changes happening through time. So, and then what do we do with this data? And I had an exercise where I was thinking about, is paleoecological work important when you think about the Sustainable Development Goals? And I just tried to think about what are the, the goals that we would feed into, and how do you think we would feed into that? So paleoecological data is useful not only for understanding our past, but also for planning our future. And we need to think about some of these things when we are planning our field work, but so that we can make sure that we're able to corroborate and collaborate with other fields and other researchers in a way that's actually useful from the very beginning, instead of just at the end when you produce a graph that people probably are not interested in just because they're in a different field.
Thank you, Esther.
Yes, thank you. That was all.
That was great. And it's really nice to see that link with the conservation and the applied side of things. Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think there was one quick talk, question that I saw come through, which was from, which was, simple one, what is the altitude of the Mau forest?
So this particular site was at the Nyafuyafui wetland is 2,895, but the Mau forest, I think you have peaks of almost 3,700. So we were nowhere near the top.
Okay,
so,
great.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, let's move on and. Yep.